The New York jury held him accountable for the first time in 30 years since his father died. Donald Trump was held accountable in that courtroom. And Jill, it was a great thing to watch from a few feet away. And when that foreperson said guilty, guilty, guilty 34 times, it was one of the most dramatic events I've ever covered. And I've covered a lot of stuff. And then watching Trump look like he'd been punched in the gut, real pain on his face, that was the pain of accountability. So I want him to feel the same way on Tuesday night when Harris carries North Carolina, which reports early. And if she wins North Carolina, it's over. There's nothing he can do about it. He can have all these people telling him, oh, don't give up. He won't give up. But everybody in the political world will know it's over.
Welcome to Just the Facts, where you get to meet some of the most newsworthy and interesting people, and I get to ask them questions that you would ask. Questions about facts and nothing but the facts. Questions you want answered. It's a dream come true for me, who was an aspiring journalist in college, and something I've always wanted to do is to be able to ask questions. And today we have a fabulous guest. We have Jonathan Alter, who has just written this wonderful book. I'm going to hold it up now so you can all see. It really is truly a great book, American Reckoning. And it's not just about the trial of Donald Trump in New York, but it's about Jonathan's growing up. And we were just talking before we came on air about the fact that I knew his mother, I know his sister, I know his brother-in-law, all fantastic people. And Jonathan, I really admired your mother, who was a real pioneer in Chicago politics, a real, shall we say, character. And I wasn't going to ask you much about her or your family, but I felt like you were my brother because we had so many overlaps. Mike Royko, Ab Mikva. I mean, there's just Ab Mikva married me and my husband. He had become a judge by then. I mean, it's just we have all these overlaps. But let's talk for a second. Well, maybe we should save your mother until later because I don't want to lose the thread about this wonderful book. And I'm going to start with the fact that this is being recorded less than 36 hours before the voting is over. And probably half the people who will vote have already voted in early voting. And I want to start by talking about the trial that you covered, which was for false reporting of business expenses. And it's being called, the Stormy Daniels payoff case, which I think is important to call it what it is, which was election interference. Do you think words make a difference in how people will perceive the importance of what you wrote about?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that I learned, I was in the courtroom all 23 days. I was one of the only reporters who was there every day. A number of others circled through. And, we all were writing these brief dispatches. I was writing for the New York Times opinion section, and I would file these short dispatches. And I mean, I thought they were fine, but we barely scratched the surface of what happened inside that historic trial. And the kind of assumptions that people made about this case were often at odds with what we were hearing in the courtroom. And because it was untelevised, people just got these kind of messages in a bottle and didn't have a really good sense. It definitely was at its heart an election interference case. The election was the 2016 election. Right. And the early testimony, early in the trial that we heard from David Pecker, the former publisher of the National Enquirer, was some of the most impactful testimony of the whole case. And when the jury was deliberating, they just asked for a couple of things to hear again. And one of them was David Pecker's testimony about what was called by the prosecution, in which the jury bought, the Trump Tower conspiracy. That in 2015, as Trump was getting ready to run for president, he and Pecker and Michael Cohen, a couple of the other usual suspects, they hatched a plan to use the National Enquirer to help elect Trump, lie about his opponents in the Republican primaries, and then Hillary Clinton just make stuff up about them. Normally with Oppo research, Oppo stories, even if it's something, that is really hard hitting, there's a grain of truth to it. That's why they do the Oppo research. These things were just made up. Ted Cruz is involved in the Kennedy assassination, or Hillary Clinton is dying, or Marco Rubio is gay. These were done they're amusing and they were fun to hear about in the courtroom, but these were done in order to interfere in the election. And the crimes that were committed, and that's a bit of a nesting doll, as it's been described, when we get into the legalities, the crimes that were committed were in the service of this conspiracy. But I just want to, if I just can for 1 second, back up and try to explain how historic this trial was. So,
before you do
that, I think
before you
a lot
do
of
that,
people just take it for granted.
Okay, I wanted to just interrupt you for a second, because one of the things you mentioned was that it wasn't televised. Right. And that perked my ears up, because I am very passionate about the fact that the federal courts do not allow any recording, any televising, and so does New York. It bars it. Most states allow the televisions and cameras to be in the courtroom.
Right.
I think it makes a huge difference. So does Brisby, obviously. He's joining me here. I think, for example, in Minnesota, the trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd, people could see the body language and hear the tone of voice and really see how the case progressed, which I think made a difference in how people accepted the verdict of guilty against a police officer. And in a case like you're talking about here in New York, or the cases that are pending against Donald Trump, for example, we are victims of the election interference. All Americans are victims. Victims have a right to see the trial. We can't all be in the courtroom. You got a very lucky pass for 23 solid days. Most reporters couldn't even be there. And as brilliant as your reporting was, as much background color as you provided, even with the addition of this wonderful book, adding even more, it's not the same as having been able to watch it. So do you think that's a big mistake? Do you think we should have cameras in the courtroom? What's your feeling on that?
Yeah, no, I'm completely for cameras in the courtroom. I mean, people shouldn't have to rely on me or the transcripts. That's people's choice right now. But we're not talking about just any other case, or even this case. Like I write a little bit about the O.J. Simpson trial in this book, because he died just shortly before this trial began in April of this year, and I covered that case one day. I got into the courtroom. I just wanted to go there, so I borrowed the Newsweek pass and went into the Simpson courtroom. I did a lot on television about it. It was a fascinating case for the reasons everybody knows. It wasn't nearly as significant as this case. So this was the most significant trial of the 21st century so far, much more significant than a murder trial, even one with great significance like George Floyd. Just to give you an example of why. So, Richard Nixon was pardoned, so he had no connection to a courtroom. A judge was involved in lifting Bill Clinton's law license for a time, suspending his law license. But that was mostly a bar matter. Other than that, in 1872, Ulysses S. Grant got a ticket for driving his carriage too fast on 13th Street in Washington. Yes. And in 1953, Harry Truman got a ticket for driving his car too slow on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And that's it, Jill. That's it. And here you have a former president who's been indicted on a total of 91 counts, if you look at all of the cases combined, and convicted on 34 of those counts. in a case where sentencing will come on November 26th. And so, the historical significance of this case, even if it's a tawdry, hush money case, cannot be overstated. And the bringing him to account. Now, if he wins the election, he can probably figure out a way out, because in that case, the big jury, the electorate, will have trumped the New York jury. Yeah. And I'd be interested in your views on whether he can go and get an injunction in federal court if he is becoming president of the United States. But if Harris wins, I and George Conway and retired Judge Grasso, they were part of my kind of courtroom buddies, and Harry Littman, a number of other people that you would know. We were, I don't know what your thoughts would be, but a lot of us who saw a lot of the testimony, and I saw more of it, much more of it than the names I just mentioned.
Yeah.
And watch this judge closely. We really think that if you look at the way those convicted on the falsification of business records statute, he's got better than a 50% chance of going to jail. And so I think if Harris wins, the judge is really ticked off at him for really good reasons, and he's not going to catch any breaks. He's a first-time offender, but other than that, everything is arguing against his avoiding jail time. I know I kind of jumped the gun on that you
No,
meant
but
to
it's
ask.
an interesting thing. And although I normally ask the questions, I'm going to answer yours before I ask the next one.
Yeah, I'm interested in your view.
I, of course, did as much as humanly possible to make sure that Richard Nixon would be indicted and tried. First, while he was the sitting president, because I personally do not believe that the Office of Legal Counsel opinion is correct. I don't think there's any reason why you can't indict and try a sitting president. I will tell you, Leon Jaworski completely disagreed with me, that he believed that impeachment was the right method for removing a criminal president. And at that time, impeachment was a viable solution because there was bipartisan support, something that doesn't exist now. I believe certainly after Nixon resigned, I went to Jaworski the same day and said, okay, you said we couldn't do it while he was the sitting president. He's a private citizen now. He has returned to California. It won't interfere with his conduct of the office. We should do it now. While arguing with him, Gerald Ford pardoned him.
Yep.
A big mistake, I believe. And therefore, we've had no accountability for criminal conduct by a president. Right. Had we had that, we wouldn't have had all this dithering and delay about indicting a former president named Trump.
Right. That's such an important point. And, I write in the book, I've interviewed 9 American presidents, either before, during, or after they left office. And one of the ones that I interviewed after he left office was Gerald Ford. And I was with my family at Vail for a conference in the summer of 2000. And I made arrangements to go and see President Ford. And I had my wife and kids with me. And Betty Ford was so gracious, and she sort of entertained our young children. And I got a chance to spend some time with Gerald Ford, and I was pressing him on the pardon. And he was, not making any news, but he was defending his granting the pardon. What kind of interested me about my own reactions that I write about in the book is that I flip-flopped on that question. So, as a senior in high school, when the pardon took place, I was totally against it, right? Yeah. Thought it was horrible. And then about 10 years later, Caroline Kennedy gave Ford the John F. Kennedy Profiles of Courage Award for the pardon. And there were quite a number of people, including Woodward and Bernstein, who believed that in retrospect they had been wrong, and that Ford was right to try to heal the nation. And I actually adopted that view for a time. So I was against the pardon, then I was for the pardon. And then with the events of this year, I became, like you, strongly against the pardon. And if it had not taken place, the Supreme Court decision in the immunity case would have been basically a moot issue. There would have already been precedent about how the Constitution should be interpreted. Nobody would have, there was no claim of immunity at the time. I don't think that Nixon was prepared to make. And so, if Nixon had been pardoned, if Nixon had not been pardoned, Donald Trump would have already been tried in Judge Chutkan's courtroom in Washington, D.C. That trial, which I was also credentialed for, was expected to open in March of this year, and it would have already taken place, and he would have been convicted in all likelihood of trying to overturn an election.
I have to add, I was and still am very disappointed in it. I did participate in a couple of panels on the pardon at the Ford Museum and then at the Ford Library. At the museum, one of Ford's sons and the young lawyer who he dispatched to San Clemente to deliver the offer of the pardon were part of the panel. That lawyer really touched my heart because he said Ford insisted that he bring a copy of the Supreme Court case that says, if you accept a pardon, you are admitting guilt, because he wanted Nixon to know that he could be pardoned, but that would be an admission of guilt. And that sort of changed my mind for a brief moment about at least not thinking that Ford had sort of been paid off to do this, which was a popular rumor at the time. Not paid off in money, but promises had been made. And that Leon Jaworski might have been involved in that. So I sort of have dropped that theory. I believe Ford acted out of his conscience. I believe he acted for good motives. I just think it was the wrong decision, and that we are, as you're saying, paying the price now. But let's get back to the trial, and let's say that there are still some undecided people. As I said, almost half of the people who will vote have voted. And although I would agree, I think you have said that anyone who knows someone who is on the fence should send a copy of your book to that person because it will change their mind. I agree, but it's the day before, so no one's going to have time to read it. So tell me a few things that you want our viewers to know that they could use to talk to people about why Donald Trump is an existential threat, why Kamala is the choice they should make. What did you learn in the trial that, pick out just a few of the most highlights that you can?
So, first of all, I really appreciate what you just said. I think my feeling about the book after the election is it will still be of use, that if Trump wins, it'll read like William Shirer's Berlin Diaries. Adolf Hitler served time in prison and then became Chancellor of Germany. And Shirer has diaries, and my book is partly in a diary form. If Harris wins, it'll be more like Jimmy Breslin's book, How the Good Guys Finally Won, his book about Watergate. And so looking at the glass half full, like, this was a real moment of accountability. And the reason that the jury found the way it did is not because they were a New York jury and Trump couldn't get a fair shake. There was overwhelming evidence, overwhelming. So a lot of people say, this was a bookkeeping thing. No, it was the law. It was the law, and he broke the law. And I have a friend who's a professor at the Harvard Business School, and he said, that statute, which takes various forms in different states, but is basically a business fraud statute. In New York, it's called falsification of business records. that's the foundation of our entire economy.
Yes.
The Harvard professor told me, if we didn't have those laws, we would be Russia or crony capitalism, where
Yes.
you can make these misrepresentations in your business relationships. You don't have to be honest. You can sign things that are lies, and you don't pay any penalty. And so I really don't have a lot of time for people to go, well, this wasn't an important law, or it shouldn't have been a felony, just a misdemeanor. They basically copped to it being a misdemeanor because they didn't even challenge that.
They didn't challenge that they
team,
were false entries, is what they didn't challenge. They knew they were false.
They knew they were
Yeah.
false. And basically, I mean, what's amazing is every day when you would see, Trump go out to the cameras in the dingy hallway, and I couldn't attend that because we were locked down those of us in the courtroom. But he would attack the judge. He sometimes repeatedly attacked the witnesses, the prosecutors. He was held in contempt 10 times.
Yeah.
He never tried to make a case on the evidence because he didn't have a case. And when people go, oh, well, the Supreme Court decision in the immunity case means that Hope Hicks's testimony, which was she was White House communications director,
Right.
so that would be covered under official acts, and that's going to blow up their whole case. No, it doesn't. It was very impactful testimony because she cried, and it landed. It was important testimony, but it was just a small part of the evidence that was used to convict Donald Trump. And so the takeaway that people need to have as they make a decision is, do they want to have a criminal as president of the United States, a convicted felon as president of the United States? And that's something people need to think about. It's so Asa Hutchinson, the Republican former governor of Arkansas, he came out against Trump. He said, I'm a former prosecutor. I just can't support somebody who's a convicted felon. Our system exists for a purpose. We believe in this country in the rule of law. We believe if a jury finds somebody guilty, that's society's verdict. And it's not for us to go, well, I like Trump. He says, he didn't even say he was innocent. He says it doesn't matter and it's a witch hunt. I believe it. No, in our country, it's kind of like the peaceful transfer of power. It's the same idea, right? And just to go to your basic question, I would also tell the undecided voter, what Trump did on January 6th, it was not just that he sat on his hands for 180 plus minutes, not doing anything when the Capitol was being attacked, and then tried to lie and say it was Nancy Pelosi's fault. It wasn't just that, which by itself is entirely disqualifying. It's what it was in the service of, which was the interruption of the peaceful transfer of power. Now, that's a phrase that people go, okay, yeah, I've heard that. Yeah, the peaceful transfer of power. Yeah, I know, I've heard that a lot. I guess that's something I should think about. No, it's not just something you should think about. It's the foundation of our entire country. So the reason George Washington was not just the first president, but arguably in the top 3 or 4 presidents, along with Lincoln and whoever, is that he left office after 2 terms, and he followed the path of the great Roman Cincinnatus, and that's where the name Cincinnati comes from. Cincinnatus, when he was dictator of Rome, which was an official position when there was an emergency, even though they wanted him to be dictator for life, which is what Julius Caesar was. This is my next book, by the way, Jill.
Oh,
he refused to do it, and George Washington took his cue from Cincinnatus, founded Society of Cincinnatus, which was a very important 18th and 19th century organization. And the whole idea was, as King George, the tyrant, said, if George Washington leaves office, he will be the greatest man in the world. Because until then, you had to go all the way back to the ancient Romans to find examples of the peaceful transfer of power. And this is what our entire system is based on. Our entire democracy is based on this.
Okay, so
So
can we go back though?
I'm sorry to get so passionate about this, but
No, I love your
Donald Trump
passion.
he is un-American. He
He
doesn't believe in our system, and he must be rejected for that reason
okay, so
alone.
first
Set
of
out all
all,
the issues aside. Let's just say he's right about immigration, right about inflation. I don't think he is, but let's just assume he is. Okay. Those pale in comparison. And this is why I have such respect for Liz Cheney and Judge Ludwig and the other conservative Republicans who are conservatives in a true way. They want to conserve our republic.
I want to ask you, going back to something you said, how I could have answered. I was canvassing in Wisconsin for a couple weeks, not for a few weeks ago, and again last week. But before I ask that question, what you're saying is making me. I debated what pin to wear for the show today. I ended up with a question mark because we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah.
But I debated this one, which I don't know if you can tell. It's a hinge because Donald Trump is unhinged. I debated this one because Donald Trump is unraveling. It's a ball of yarn unraveling. Or whether I would wear one of my Lady Justice pins because I'm praying for justice in all of this. But the question I wanted to ask is, when I was campaigning, I made the arguments that you're making about, this was to someone who was with a military background, and I said, well, how would you feel about having a commander-in-chief who isn't eligible to enlist in the Army because he's a convicted felon?
That's a good argument, yeah.
Well, I thought it was. The guy said to me, oh, please don't go there. It's only because the Democrats went after him. Every businessman does that. And no one would have been prosecuted if it wasn't Donald Trump.
So in answer to that question, well, first of all, I would have recommended that he look at the video of General Kelly talking to a guy in a MAGA cap. So this, as I'm not a veteran myself, I was too young for Vietnam. My father flew 31 combat missions defending democracy. He was shot down over Europe in World War II. The idea of a veteran voting for a guy who called my father's fallen colleagues losers and suckers, who was on many, not just one or two, but on many occasions said Hitler did some good things. He's not Hitler, but he's kind of Hitler adjacent, right? I mean, he according to his ex-wife, he was reading Hitler's speeches, and he is a would-be dictator. And so our military respects our system and understands that they take an oath to the Constitution, not to the commander-in-chief. And anybody in the military understands this. And he's trying to change that. And as far as this being Democrats who are going after, yes, it's true that prosecutors are elected. And, they're going to go, on some level, it is political. But if you look at any, and public integrity sections of U.S. attorneys' offices, there's always an element of selective prosecution. It has a bad name, but if you're going to devote all those resources to a case, of course you are going to, if you have to make choices, if you find that a politician has broken the law, you're going to be more likely, in the interest of public integrity, in going after that person than you would somebody else. But what this gentleman at the door doesn't understand is that in New York alone, there are hundreds of people who are prosecuted under the falsification of business records statute. It's not like they took some bill and, never used, we're going to use it against Trump. That's not what happened. They had a tremendous amount of evidence of law breaking that they gathered, which, by the way, after a lot of times it's pointed out that Alvin Bragg's predecessor, Cy Vance, who's a good guy who I'm friendly with, declined to prosecute. But what never gets mentioned is that a lot of new evidence came in around the time that Bragg became DA. And, these prosecutors, as you know so well, they're making these decisions based on how much evidence they have and how much the likelihood they have of a conviction. So, I would also say to him as a veteran, like, do you think General Kelly is a liar? Do you think that Donald Trump, if it's General Kelly saying that he disrespected our war dead, Donald Trump saying he didn't? By the way, General Kelly was only one of 13 people who heard Donald Trump disrespect our war dead. And many of them, including the former National Security Advisor, former Secretary of Defense, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and like 1,000, literally more than 1,000 other people who've served in national security positions, many of them in the Trump administration, they say he's dangerous. They're shouting as loud as they can that he's dangerous. And so does this man at the door really think that the fact that the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the former White House chief of staff, both use the F word, fascist, to define Donald Trump? That's not liberal Democrats. That's military men. 2 generals were calling him a fascist. And he's supposed to just dispense with that as like partisan politics? So somebody like that, I don't think you can argue with. The person we're talking about is your cousin, your uncle, your whatever, who is not MAGA. That guy was MAGA, right? But there are a lot of other people that are going, you know what? I haven't done so well in recent years, concerned about immigration. I think even though Trump's 20% tariff is a huge tax, and every economist, and Elon Musk say that it will cause a recession. Do you see Elon Musk just said the other day that Trump's policies would cause a recession in the short term, but things would be better in the long term? But let's just assume that, your cousin thinks Trump's better on the economy, thinks he's better on immigration.
Which is wrong on the facts.
Just assume they think that. Let's assume. So you've got that on the one hand. Then on the other hand, you have the risk that he will use his power to hurt those who disagree with him, as he has been promising to do over and over again. I think one of Kamala Harris's best lines, just very recent, is she says, I will bring my political opponents in and compromise with them. He wants to prosecute them, put them in jail, and not just use the military and the National Guard, which is mind-blowing, and against the enemy from within, which he says is more dangerous than China or Russia, the enemy from within that this unhinged man is talking about.
And let's define who he says the enemy is. It's Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and other Democrats. It's not terrorists. So it's not the people who attacked.
So it's even worse than that. So far, he actually didn't mention Chuck Schumer. He hasn't said he wants to use the military against Chuck Schumer. He's mentioned Liz Cheney, Shifty Schiff, Adam Schiff, and, quote, the Pelosi's. Now, I want to pause on that for a moment with you, Jill. The Pelosi's. Nancy and Paul Pelosi. When Paul Pelosi was 82 years old, an intruder, a MAGA intruder, broke into their house in San Francisco when Nancy Pelosi was not there and beat him with a hammer and fractured his skull. And when he was still in the hospital and near death, fortunately he recovered, Donald Trump, not once, not twice, but 3 times, made jokes about this ailing man and made up conspiracy theories about Paul Pelosi. This was sick and cruel enough to disqualify him in the minds of anybody who has any kind of shred of empathy, which most Americans and most Trump supporters do. They are empathetic people. They're just not connecting this most unempathetic, most cruel of men to this. And as if that wasn't bad enough, making jokes and conspiracy theories about Paul Pelosi, he's now saying he would use the National Guard, or he said, or maybe the military against Paul Pelosi because he's married to Nancy Pelosi. So what you have to go is, okay, so somebody, he doesn't really mean it.
No.
But the question a voter has to ask, do you want to take the risk that he means what he says? And what we know about authoritarians around the world is they only tell the truth about one thing. They all say, from Hitler to all of them, all the bad guys out there now. Putin, he said he wants to reassemble the old Soviet Union. And Trump won't stop him, of course. Trump will give him the green light. But they always say what they're going to do. So when Trump says he wants to suspend the Constitution and be a dictator on day one, the only part of that that's maybe not true is the day one part. It's hard to see him being satisfied with just one day of getting his way. And then, when he talks about retribution over and over again, the idea of him getting in there and going, oh, you know what? I'm not going to seek retribution against my political enemies. Scratch that. I just said that during the campaign. Chances of that are very slim. He will seek extra constitutional, illegal retribution with the knowledge that the Supreme Court probably won't prevent him from doing so.
Well, they certainly won't. They have given him the green light. Something you mentioned today, Joe Jaworski, the grandson of Leon Jaworski, just sent me an op-ed that his father, the son of Leon Jaworski, had written, which talks about Leon, who was a war crime prosecutor in Nuremberg, talking about how Hitler took over gradually. It wasn't like he suddenly said, okay, all rules are off. It was one thing and then another and then another and another. And I personally, I know you've been hesitant to do a comparison to Hitler. I'm not so hesitant. I really feel, is that right? Because I feel like we're in 1939 and that we're about to lose all of our rights one at a time.
I wrote a piece that just posted overnight on my Substack newsletter, which is called Old Goats.
It's a terrific Substack. In addition to your book, people should read that.
It's called No Furor Over the Fuhrer. Yeah. And I recount Trump's long connection and his fascination with Hitler and why it is, I've resisted Hitler comparisons my whole professional career. I really didn't like it when George W. Bush was compared to Hitler during the Iraq War. I really didn't like Obama with the mustache. And it's just such a normally it's such a lazy-minded way of doing political analysis. And I've always thought that Mussolini was a better comparison. I still believe that Putin, Bolsonaro, Orban, who just called Trump the other day, that's the strongman club that Trump is taking his cues from. He's not literally taking his cues from Hitler, but there are things that are similar. And, and it's just that he subbed migrants for Jews. So they're willing, we found out on 60 Minutes the other week, the guy who's going to be the head of Department of Homeland Security under Trump.
That was so awful.
They're going to snatch people from their homes in the middle of the night, American citizens. You go, how could they do that with American citizens? Because they're related to the undocumented who they're trying to get, right? I actually don't have a problem with calling them illegal aliens because they are. That I think liberals have been too whatever about that. But so if you have somebody, an illegal alien that they're trying to deport and ask, well, how about that person's kids on 60 Minutes? The guy said, well, they'll take the kids too, even if they're American citizens.
Right.
Yeah, even if they're American citizens. So think about that for a minute. Where are they going to put them? In detention camps. Are those Nazi death camps? No. But they do bear a certain resemblance to the Japanese internment camps that we had here. So this is scary stuff. And people really have to have a gut check and ask themselves, are we up for this? And I try to deal with all of this in addition to the trial in the book, because what was worrying me all year long is that we were sleepwalking
Yes.
toward losing our freedom and our democracy.
And you do a very good job of that, because I think your book, as you said, will be relevant after the election, no matter what happens, because it does show parallels that are very scary. And I think when he says some of the things he says, we should believe him. And it's maybe one of the most troubling thing is, well, two of the most troubling are, one, the high-level Republicans who continue to enable him, the Supreme Court that enables him, and the fact that at least 70 million people are going to vote for him. I get that some people don't like Democratic policies. They think we're too woke. For
They're right about
example,
that, by the way. They're right.
well,
Some of their
yeah, I mean,
critiques are
saying,
right. The
as you
wokeness
said, saying
what
illegal aliens becomes, and I personally think undocumented immigrants is maybe a better term. I would prefer that, but I'm not going to go to battle over that particular phrase. But so much of what Democrats stand for is being misinterpreted and as wokeness. And some of our the Republicans who will vote for Trump, who are, as you've been describing all the reasons why I should have said to this man, how can you vote for him? You're a veteran. And he disses you. He does not respect you. Think of what he said about John McCain, about not being with people who have any kind of physical disability,
Yeah, yeah.
because it makes him look bad. Oh my
Like
God. I
people
mean,
who've lost their limbs in battle, he doesn't want to be seen with.
exactly. I
It
mean,
just goes on and on. It's just
it does.
reprehensible.
And there's just no answer. But I don't know, maybe we need to end on a higher note and try to give some hope. But before
Yeah.
we get to that ending with hope, I said I wanted to ask something about your mom, and who I greatly admired for her accomplishments, for being the first woman elected in Illinois, at least, and someone who stood up to Mayor Daley, the first Mayor Daley, who was a powerhouse of unbelievable proportions. And I know that she supported the Equal Rights Amendment, that was something that I am currently very, as passionate as I am about cameras in the courtroom, I am even more passionate about the Equal Rights Amendment and the fact that we don't have it. And that all that stands in the way is the president saying, publish it to the archivist. I've recently been reading about the archivist, and I'm a little worried that she would not do whatever she was ordered. But what do you think your mother would have said about this, and the fact that 38 states have ratified it, and yet it's not been implemented as part of our Constitution?
Well, first of all, she was a big admirer of you. She really respected what you were doing. I think she had thought that she was going to go to law school and never did, and so she saw people like you as pioneers. And she was very involved in efforts to ratify the ERA. And so I think she would be cheering you on in this. I tell the story, Jill, in my book of how the whole thing began for our family, and it was 10 years before I was born. And my mother, whose name was Joanne, later Joanne Alter, at the time Joanne Hammerman, and
Yeah.
she was a student at Mount Holyoke, and she was assigned to take Eleanor Roosevelt around campus in 1948. And Eleanor was the most famous woman in the world.
Yeah.
She had just written the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. And after the tour was over, Eleanor said, "Now, where do you live, Joanne?" And my mother said, "Oh, over on the other side of campus." She said, "Well, I want to see your dormitory." And so they go over to my mother's dorm, and Eleanor plops down on my mother's bed and says, "Now tell me about yourself, Joanne. Where are you from? What are you interested in? How do you want to make a better world?" And this just changed my mother's life. She was from a non-political family. And so my mother got, very interested in politics, and we had Martin Luther King in our home when I was a kid, and she got my father interested in it, and then all of us, and even just the questions that Eleanor was asking her, my mother became very curious. Before we went on the air, you described her as a character, and she was kind of a character. And one of the things that made her a character is she would go up to you and she said, "Now, Jill," and she'd start firing questions at you the way Eleanor Roosevelt did to her, right? And what's the foundation of journalism in my development as a journalist? It's that curiosity, and in my case, love of politics and belief in this country, belief in the ideals of this country. So what's tested is this sense of whether the American people are going to make the right call. So it's really all on the line. John F. Kennedy described himself as an idealist without illusions. Yeah. And for many, many years, I just try to describe myself the same way. That's what I wanted to be, an idealist without illusions. And in the last 8 years, I've realized I had more illusions about the good sense of the American people than I thought I did. And now, so I've been a little bit disillusioned, not in democracy, but in this common sense. And I write about this a lot in the book as it relates to my interactions with people like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. But I can have that idealism restored on Tuesday. It can be restored. There's a famous line that, Americans always do the wrong thing right up until the last moment, and then they finally do the right thing. And so they're not going to, the voters, because of the 70 million they're not going to be able to entirely restore my faith. But if Kamala Harris is elected, it will it will show me that the basic decency and common sense and patriotism, because what Donald Trump is doing is deeply un-American, that patriotism and idealism can be redeemed, and that we can build what Eleanor Roosevelt called a better world.
I really related to your description of the illusions that you had, because I too grew up in a family that respected government no matter who held the office, that the president was somebody to be revered. And so imagine my disillusion when I listened to Watergate tapes and heard the voice and words of the president. It was extremely disillusioning and disheartening. I've overcome that, and I still want to be in a position to respect the presidency. I hope we can go back to bipartisanship, which would mean that, you do compromise. No one comes out 100%, but that's how things get done. You've had this amazing background with your mother being so politically active and taking you to campaign when you were in a stroller and thereafter, and starting your journalism career. And you've interviewed now, 9 presidents, I think, and have had some really good insights. It's interesting because you end on a hopeful note with Lincoln's famous second inaugural. And that sort of touched me, because you were talking about the better angels of our nature. And do you think that we can get back to a place where all of us, including the people who vote for Trump for whatever reason, that the better angels will somehow prevail and maybe bring them back into a mainstream fold?
It's not going to be all of us. It never is. We've had demagogues in this country for a long time. Until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we had no democracy in the South. Black people couldn't vote. The South was not a democracy. And we've had mean people before, and, with great cruelty, racism, the whole thing. And that's part of the American story. The difference is it never got to the level of president. So, what we need to do is make sure that these divisions and the bad angels, who are always going to be there with the better angels, don't prevail. So what Lincoln was talking about was that eventually, through what he called the mystic chords of memory, meaning our memory of the ideals that this nation was founded upon, that, even if we haven't lived up to them in a lot of ways, but they were these ideals. All men are created equal, peaceful transfer
All
of power.
men.
Well,
Pass the
all
Equal Rights
people.
Amendment, and all
Yeah.
women will be
Yes.
included
All
in that
women.
phrase. Thank you.
So here's the thing. Like, this is what I, really, one of the things I really respect about Barack Obama. I went with him on the 50th anniversary of the March from Selma to Montgomery, on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And, he spoke that day about all of these times when America has fallen short. But then he quotes Dr. King: the arc of the moral universe is long. It takes a long time to include women, but it bends towards justice. So what we have to keep hopeful about is that it will bend towards justice and accountability, which is part of justice. And that's what's really at issue in this election with what I call the big jury. The New York jury held him accountable for the first time in 30 years since his father died. Donald Trump was held accountable in that courtroom. And Jill, it was a great thing to watch from a few feet away. And when that foreperson said guilty, guilty, guilty 34 times, it was one of the most dramatic events I've ever covered. And I've covered a lot of stuff. And then watching Trump look like he'd been punched in the gut, real pain on his face, that was the pain of accountability. And he puts his game face on when he goes out in front of the cameras. So I want him to feel the same way on Tuesday night when Harris carries North Carolina, which reports early. And if she wins North Carolina, it's over. There's nothing he can do about it. He can have all these people telling him, oh, don't give up. He won't give up. But everybody in the political world will know it's over. So that's kind of the happiest possible scenario. More likely, we're going to be waiting for days until Pennsylvania comes in. Yeah. But we do have the chance to deliver serious, small d democratic accountability in this election. And that then will begin the healing process. It won't bring everybody in. The fight with MAGA and those elements will be, again, to quote John F. Kennedy on the Cold War, a long twilight struggle. We and our children will be fighting these authoritarians, these autocrats, in some cases these fascists, for a long time. But this is the moment of decisive battle in that struggle.
I hope that we have in this country a landslide that will put a lid on, and I don't like to call it fascism because I'm not sure people understand that, but on authoritarian rule, on what could be the start of whittling away at our constitutional rights.
I don't think it's going to be a landslide. I don't have illusions. I don't think it's going to be a landslide. And so we're not going to be able to get rid of this. But right now, this is I guess the way to put it is, this is not a drill. Our constitutional republic is on the line. So the key thing to do is win, and we can worry about what comes next in terms of the longer struggle with these authoritarian elements another day. But first, they have to be defeated.
Wow. And that is what is on the agenda for tomorrow. Everyone viewing us, make sure you vote. More importantly, make sure you get 3 other people to vote, because in a close election, 3 votes per precinct can be the difference between victory and loss. And in this case, as Jonathan Alter just said, loss is the defeat of our democracy. So we must get out there. I hope you've enjoyed this episode as much as I've enjoyed talking to Jonathan, that you will go online and subscribe so that you don't miss any future episodes, and let other people know to follow this this YouTube show, so that they don't miss another episode. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being with us. Jonathan, thank you so much. It was great to talk to you.
Thanks, Jill.